becomes a friend, helps us ascend up from life's cares to the sky. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us toward light to draw nigh. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us toward light to draw nigh.
Please join us. 1, 2, 3.
Life is a dream, time like a stream, carries our burdens away. Never despair, joys everywhere. Love can befriend you today. Freed from all care, like birds on the air, soar above griefs and worries, seek joy and be gay. Often on earth, things of great worth, worldly ambitions defy. Sometimes a friend helps us ascend up from life's cares to the sky. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us toward light to draw nigh. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us toward light to draw nigh.
Bravi!
Beautiful. So we want to share with you this afternoon of ways in which Swamiji's life has been a life of discipleship. We've all heard Swamiji say, I really have 2 goals in life. One is to find God, and the other is to help all of you find God. And these are 2 of the aspects when we make our vow of discipleship that Swamiji has lived to perfection. The one is the inner work that we must do in order to find God and in order to progress on the spiritual path. And the other is that we don't keep this, what we have from our inner work, for ourselves, but we share it with those that we know in the way that they can receive it. And Swamiji was always so perfect in his way of tuning in to each one of us, to every individual that he spoke to understand how that person would be able to receive what he wanted to give as a disciple of a great master. We were talking earlier about what a blessing it has been for all of us who didn't know Yogananda to instead have the blessing to have known Swamiji, who was his direct disciple. And so much of what we know of Yogananda is from Swamiji. He has tried to share through his books and all of his music as much of Master as he could. He would always be willing to share. sometimes people would ask out of the blue, could you tell us the story of Master? And he would pause a moment and he'd say, you know, I don't have stories that I can just pick up out of my pocket and tell of Master. And then in the situation he was in, he would be able to think of a story that was a lesson or some quality that Master showed that the people who were there needed to hear. And I always felt that this was very largely a part of Swamiji's own humility. He talked about, when he talked about discipleship, the importance of our being humble in order to be able to receive. Because you can imagine if someone comes to a great master and asks a question, and the master is tuning in, begins to respond, and the disciple or the listener says, yes, I know that. Oh yes, that I know that. Even if they don't, because they don't want to show that they don't know. But for the devotee, it's very important to be willing to show that we don't know. And Swamiji never felt that he knew everything. He would never, as he would often say, pull the Yogananda card out of his pocket and say, I know because I was with Yogananda, you should listen to me. He was very humble in his familiarity with Yogananda, because he knew that in order to be able to learn, we can't already say, I know. As soon as we say, I know, we've cut off the energy that is trying to help us to know. So Swamiji was one who would always be willing to learn from anyone. And I think this was one of the greatest lessons that he tried to give to everyone who was close to him and everyone who was in any kind of a training class for being ministers, for being light bearers, for being teachers. He would always help us to realize that we all can learn from anyone who comes to us, and that God is often trying to come to us, that Yogananda, Master, is often trying to come to us through the most humble person in order to help us to learn that lesson. The other quality that I admire so in Swamiji, because I have felt that I lack it in my life, and he has tried to encourage it in me, is simply the quality of courage. Courage in many situations to do what Master always said to do. Try to do something new every day. Bite off more than you can chew, and then chew it. It was Master's way of saying, you are so much more than you think you are, or than you realize that you are. And so you need to have the courage to go beyond your own limitations. And Swamiji, when he was a student of Master's, we know that he didn't do very much Ananda yoga. He didn't do much yoga. He always said his body didn't seem really to be made for practicing yoga. And yet, when Master asked him to come up in front of everybody, Walter, would you please come and demonstrate the postures? And Swamiji did it, because he knew if Master asked him to do that, this was something that would help him to overcome his own limitations. Swamiji was very courageous, particularly where it concerned Yogananda's work. He would not, well, we all know that he stood back in the beginning when he separated from SRF. He decided to do the work of creating communities because SRF wasn't interested in doing that. Dayamata had said she wasn't interested. So he put all of his energy for Master's work into creating the Ananda communities, and we're all very grateful for that. I know I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for his courage in developing Master's World Brotherhood colonies. And his in doing that, he knew that it was something that was what Master wanted to be done, but he didn't have the experience. He had inspiration, but he didn't have the experience of doing it. And so his way of creating the foundation of Ananda was to draw on people like Jyotish and Jaya and those who were there in the very beginning, and to ask them, would you like to help? And they would help. He wasn't a leader who felt that he had to show that he knew how to do everything. So he had the courage to be humble in the situations where he could draw on others to be able to help him to build this work. And he talks about trying to build a building. He had no experience as a carpenter, and yet he had the courage to try, to keep going when the buildings fell down. And he was also able to work with people. You know, his courage was one of involving people rather than the courage of, I can do it alone. Swamiji had to face a lot of trials in his life, and some of them were actual legal trials, and most of you know those stories. He did not give in when it concerned the principle of being able to serve Master's work. He knew that everyone who was at Ananda, in the 3 or 4 communities that existed at that time, he knew that they all were dedicated to Yogananda, to this path of self-realization, to Kriya Yoga, to their practices, and he didn't want to give up on something that he knew Master had wanted. And so he, in a legal trial, in a sense, he fought against his own Guru Bhais, and it was not easy for him to do. But he would not abandon Dharma because his Guru Bhais were seeing something that was not true. And so Ananda still exists today and has the spiritual power and the ability to touch so many lives today because Swamiji had the courage to stand alone amidst his Guru Bhais with the help of his of the devotees that he had brought to this path of Kriya. And in that courage, he also taught us. He taught Ananda. He taught the leadership of Ananda, that sometimes you will have to face alone something that is very difficult. But if you know that it's right and you stand for what is right, then Dharma in the end will win. And when, is it Master or Swamiji? Master says, an easy life is not a victorious life. And so we can't say that that Swamiji had an easy life, but he did have a victorious life. He was victorious in building the dream of World Brotherhood colonies in America, in Europe, in India. He was victorious in bringing Master's teachings in their original forms, first in the English language and then the translations into many other languages. And he was victorious in touching the lives of all of those who came because he was a direct disciple of a great master and avatar. He always talked about the fact that Master said, the men in the ashram have disappointed me, and you can't disappoint me. And how Swami took that was not that these men were not good devotees or good, they're in their spiritual life, but that he really needed someone who would follow in the steps that he had brought to the West and really carry this teaching into the countries and the parts of the world that Yogananda himself was not able to go to personally. And I find it very touching that in the end Swami came back to India to do the same thing. And I don't know how many of you know the story of this. I will share this and then let others speak. When Swamiji thought about coming to India, it was always with the question, is Master known in India? Is Yogananda being given are his teachings being given the importance in the spiritual life as other teachers, not as a comparison, but knowing what Master had to offer. And sometimes he would think this wasn't really happening, and he would talk about coming to India, and then he would see the books that were coming out. There were new books coming with Master's teachings, and he would see that they were being printed by YSS, and he'd say, oh no, they're getting Master out, this is a good thing. Until at one point, a couple got hold of Swamiji through email, I think, and they had been publishing these books in YSS. They were making sure that word got out, and they had, and I won't go into the long story, they had been removed from that position, so there was no one again putting that message out, those books out. And they called Swamiji and said, may we come to Italy to see you? And they came, and Swamiji spoke with them. They shared what they saw as what was happening. From that moment, Swamiji, from one day being in Italy till who knows when, to the next day, we're going to India. Because the ability to bring Master to his own people in India is being squashed. We need to make sure that Master doesn't get shut out of his own country. And so Swamiji left within a couple of weeks, and he had Asha and David and Durga and Vidura and other people that came with him, in fact ahead of him, and they found the first house in Gurgaon that would serve as the ashram there for many years. At that point, Swamiji was 80 years old, more or less. Maybe not quite 80. He was at the age of most people's retirement. It was not a time when most people take on a work like really making Master well known in India. But he could not, he had the courage and the will to make that happen. And so he came to India. And I don't know how many of you were in Gurgaon in those early years, but it was such a joy to see the light in the eyes and the souls of the people who were just waiting for this to come in the way that Swami Kriyananda could do that, and the people of Ananda. I think if we can try in our own way, in our own life, to have the courage to bring Master in whatever way he would like us to others, that we too will find that Master works through us in whatever ways we allow him to. And that is what I hope for all of you, for this beautiful community in Pune, that it will grow as the other Ananda communities have, representing Yogananda's teachings and Master's qualities of discipleship for many generations to come.